And I think it brings me to the key message of my talk. When we think of brands, when we think of organizations, when we think of management, we very much have an image in our mind that comes straight from the 20th century, from the middle of the 20th century. So imagine a manager from 1974 sitting in an office in 2014. What would be surprising for him or her? Well, the internet would be fairly new. Maybe there wasn't mobile phones in 1974. But otherwise, they would be fairly used to the routines, the practices, the way of doing things. So we still very much think in this old frame, in this old kind of pattern when it comes to kind of imagining how organizations and brands work. I just put up some of the key assumptions that have grown very dear to us and that we have big problem to kind of live without or think about differently. So we have the organization as the locus of production and innovation. We have a hierarchical kind of managerial, visible hand that controls the organization. Consumption is wasting away. Consumption is kind of, literally consumption is a word from, had a very different meaning in around 1900. It actually meant wasting, destroying, using up. So we still think of consumption as an act that actually destroys value. And kind of branding kind of plays the role of a lubricant to sell to the external world and plays an increasing role in internal branding. That whole picture is a picture that was true 50 years ago, maybe even 100 years ago. How does hierarchy relate to distributed to open innovation? What are the mechanisms through which that can happen? The promise or the suspicion was that the brand is a mechanism, or branding is a mechanism, an organizing device that can help to manage that circle, that kind of fluid process of co-creation. The three elements through which branding can do that is communication. So branding is the process of designing these interfaces, of making sure that people between different autonomous subsystems talk to each other, that they exchange ideas, and so on. So very important function. Second point, co-creation. Think you have a bunch of people out there that you don't even know, you haven't hired them, you can't fire them. How can you get them to contribute meaningfully to your product? It's not, a lot of CEOs are scared if they open up the door and then people will start doing stuff. Well, it doesn't happen like that. You have to think, how can you integrate the different ideas, inputs, their creative outputs in a meaningful way? Well, branding is that process of providing people with a story, with a language that allows people to tell their own stories within that language. It's kind of a grammar that structures interaction. And lastly, evaluation. Companies have a big problem of finding out what is valuable in this space. There's so much produced, abundance, too much. How can we figure out what's important, what really matters? Well, all these little evaluations that are constantly being produced, TripAdvisor, Google, these are all mechanisms that evaluate constantly. Yeah. The branding is a process that kind of engages with these evaluations, and they kind of put values onto things, that make values visible, that even bestow new values upon things. There are a couple of implications that follow from that, a couple of propositions that I wrote up mainly to wake you up and to provoke you, that might make us think differently about the brand. And they're open for discussion, so you might agree with them, you might not agree with them. So number one, forget brand and organization. So sorry for the organizers of this day, but I just crossed out your title. Forget brand and organization. Instead, think of branding as a set of micro-practices that organize distributed innovation in networks. Yeah. So we very much focus on thinking in nouns, big things like there's the brand, there's the organization, there's the firm, there's the CEO, and there's the unique selling propositions. So we really try to kind of fit our thinking into that system. But what happens in distributed networks is that we have very fluid processes. There's very little is stable in there. A lot of stuff is fluid. A lot of stuff is in motion, is moving. So maybe we should think about branding instead of brands as a big thing, as a noun. We should think of branding as a process, as something that we do that kind of facilitates exchange, that facilitates co-creation, that facilitates evaluation. But branding as a process would be something quite different to branding as something where you have a brand wheel that you draw up, where you have brand values that you identify, and identifying a space on a map and say, this is our place within the competitive landscape. So really going away from that very territorial thinking, very kind of traditional thinking, to something that thinks of branding as a process that enables and controls. It's always give and take at the same time. Point number two, forget about the brand manager as authority. So, do we need a chief brand officer, as Gieb has argued for? I'm not sure about that, so I have a question mark there. Instead, think of a brand manager as a curator, telling a story through other people's works. So a brand manager as an author is an idea that's very much linked to kind of being an author and having authority. Yeah? But if you look at distributed networks, if you look at kind of open networks, you will find that there's no one single author of an idea. There's distributed authorships. Lots of people tell lots of stories that kind of create a grander narrative, a more interesting, a richer narrative. But there's no one author. That's why I'm not sure whether the brand manager can claim to be the owner of any kind of brand value or say like, look, I'm the guy who knows, or I can define the brand values. Maybe that's an illusion that makes us sleep better, anxiety reduction, you know, kind of makes us feel in control. We look good when we talk to our colleagues because we say we own these values. But is it really realistic? Are you the author of these values? No, you're not. You can be a custodian of them. You can be a governor of them. You can be a curator of them. All these words that are more soft power words in the language of diplomacy are probably much more useful than these hard power words of I'm the author, I'm an officer, chief officer of the brand. Yeah? So maybe we have to kind of step a little bit back in our claims in order to actually reach out much further. Yeah? So maybe less is more.